Maybe we should also admit that it cannot be easy to build confident and prosperous societies from nations that for centuries have their natural resources looted and their peoples traded as commodities. For centuries, the world has been unwilling and unable to confront the realities of the consequences of the slave trade. But gradually, this is changing, and it is time to bring the subject of reparations firmly to the fore. Granted, the current generations are not the ones that engaged in the slave trade, but that grand inhuman enterprise was state-sponsored and deliberate, and its benefits are clearly interwoven with the present-day economic architecture of the nations that designed and executed it. Reparations must be paid for the slave trade. No amount of money will ever make up for the horrors, but it would make the point that evil was perpetrated, that millions of productive Africans were snatched from the embrace of our continent and put to work in the Americas and the Caribbean without compensation for their labor. If there are any hesitations in some minds about the paying of reparations, it is worth considering the fact that when slavery was abolished, the slave owners were compensated for the loss of the slaves because the human beings were labeled as property, deemed to be commodities. Surely, this is a matter that the world must confront and can no longer ignore. The African Union has authorized Ghana to hold a global conference on the issue in November in Accra.
So I want us to watch this speech made by the Ghanaian President, Nana Akufo-Addo, at the United Nations General Assembly. I think it's a speech that is really inspirational and is something that we Africans must get to hear. And please, do me a favor by dropping a comment in the comment section below. Let me know what you think about what the Ghanaian president said.
I do not need to employ any hyperbole, nor find any fancy words to state the reality of the situation humanity currently faces. Our world is not a happy place today. Wherever we look, and in whichever area of our lives to which we turn our attention, there is unhappiness, distrust, and loss of confidence in the structures that have guided the governance of the world since the end of the Second World War, nearly 8 decades ago. Mr. President, the theme chosen for this meeting is rebuilding trust and reigniting global solidarity, accelerating action on the 2030 Agenda and its sustainable development goals towards peace, prosperity, progress, and sustainability for all. The choice of the theme implies that there's general acknowledgement that things are not what they ought to be in our world. The mutual trust among nations that is required to ensure harmony has considerably diminished. The cohesion that we need to build the peace and prosperity of our societies is disintegrating and nearing Cold War lows. We do not seem to have any common values on which we can all agree, nor common goals to which we all aspire. The fault lines are not just between poor and rich, or the South and North, or the developed and developing countries. Even within well-established and rich countries, the tensions over trade, climate, political boundaries, and geopolitical spheres of influence are palpable. Long-held definitions are being challenged, and sacred truths and beliefs are being questioned or discarded outright, and in some instances, the deliberate peddling of blatant untruths has become acceptable. This organization, the United Nations, under whose auspices we, the nations of the world, are gathered for the annual review of the world, was established in the belief that our common humanity would be the overriding consideration in dealing with the problems that would invariably arise when we deal with one another. There is no doubt that the organization has achieved a great deal in its 78 years of existence, of which we can all be justifiably proud. But it is also true that the reluctance by the nations that were the major powers at the formation of the organization to agree to any reform to reflect present realities has led to the undermining of the credibility of the United Nations and some of its organs, in particular, the Security Council. Ghana is currently serving out the second of its two-year term on the Security Council as a non-permanent member. This is the fourth time in the 66 years since we joined the UN, the first post-colonial African nation to do so, that we've had the privilege of serving on the Council. Mr. President, it has been a sad and disappointing experience for us. We've witnessed it firsthand, over and over again, that the big powers of the United Nations might be preaching democracy, fairness, and justice around the world, but are happy to practice the opposite here at the United Nations, prioritizing parochial interests over those of humanity. Back in 2017, the first time I addressed the General Assembly as President of my country, I spoke at length on the need to reform of the United Nations and of the Security Council in particular. I said then that the urgent need to reform this organization had been talked about and scheduled for a long time, but somehow we've never found the courage and the will to execute it.
You know, I have always thought of the West as a bunch of hypocrites. Yeah, that's always been my opinion. Not what they do in their countries, because as far as that is concerned, they've done so well for their people in their countries. Like the people in America or in Europe enjoy one of the highest level of democracy, human rights, freedom, and so on and so forth. That is for sure. But the hypocrisy comes in when it comes to issues with other countries or Africa. They would come out and say they are in support of democracy, but behind the scenes, they support authoritarian leaders. They only find trouble with a leader in Africa when that leader does not allow them to take away what they want from the continent. If there's a leader in Africa like Teodoro Obiangema Obiazogo of Equatorial Guinea, who has been there for almost 4 decades, but allows them to take away anything they want from the country, they have no problem with somebody like that. Or the Bongos, who have been there for almost 50 years, they have no problem with that. So the West do not really stand for democracy. They do not. They might say it. They might preach it when they meet us, the Africans, but no, they don't stand for it. Because there are a huge number of African leaders who are authoritarian, and they are being supported by the West. They are being funded by the West. So how do you balance these two things? If you think that the West really meant what they are saying about democracy in Africa, then you must be mistaken. They do not. But let's continue.
I said then that Ghana supports UN reform, especially of the Security Council, as set out in Africa's common position on UN reform, based on the Ezulwini Consensus. Mr. President, I said then that the time was long overdue to correct the long-standing injustice that the current structure and composition of the United Nations Security Council represent for the nations of Africa. After serving on the Council at this difficult time in the world, our views on the need for reform have been even more strongly reasserted. We cannot continue to preach democracy, equality, and good governance around the globe. We cannot insist on peace and justice in the world when our global organization is seen by the majority of its members and the people of the world as hampered by an unjust and unfair structure. Mr. President, the Assembly has quite properly chosen the rebuilding of trust as critical in restoring stability and prosperity to our world. We cannot rebuild that trust when the organization that should bind us is seen by many as helping to perpetuate an unfair world order, which is reinforced by an inequitable, dysfunctional global financial architecture. Mr. President, for the past year and a half, a full-scale war is being waged in the center of Europe. The United Nations appears unwilling or unable to influence the events taking place in Ukraine. Ghana has sat on the Security Council throughout this period and can testify that the global solidarity we seek to reignite under the umbrella of the UN will only happen if and when it suits those who wield the mighty power of veto. And at the moment, there's nothing to show that these countries have any interest or inclination to do so. Ghana still believes that this organization provides the best vehicle for the world to manage its hydra-headed problems, but it can only function effectively and meet our expectations when we reform the pillars upon which it rests. Anything short of that will continue to undermine its credibility. Mr. President, I do not refer to the events in Ukraine and seek to pretend to ignore the tragic events in my own neighborhood of West Africa and the Sahel. Instability in the Sahel and widespread terroristic activities have put West African countries under severe political pressure and economic strain. Several countries in the region have lost vast stretches of territory to the rampaging terrorists. Coups d'etats have reemerged as what some mistakenly hope would be the solution to the threats that confront their nations. We in the West African region are trying as best as we can, under the very trying conditions we face, to deal with the situation. We are convinced that the conflicts that continue to plague our continent and our region, in particular, would be more satisfactorily resolved if the international community was to support, not undermine, the efforts of our regional and continental organizations to deal with them. Africans fought and died in the Second World War in defense of Europe and her allies, who reset the world towards the path of peace and prosperity that their nations and citizens have enjoyed for decades now. It is surely time for the world to reciprocate in our time of need. Mr. President, we in Ghana are holding firm to our belief in democracy as the best route to build the prosperous nation that is our aim. It is true that the economic dividends that many of our citizens justifiably expect from the democratic process have not come as fast as had been anticipated. But we're determined to hold fast to the course because we believe that ultimately it will succeed in delivering freedom and prosperity for the mass of our people. We're also having to countenance for the first time in recent human history not just the question of democracy and a deliberate campaign of disinformation against democracy, but also the propagation of authoritarian rule as the faster route to economic advancement.
Well, I just have to say this, right? I respect President Nana Akufo-Addo because I have seen some videos and also read some articles about what he is doing in Ghana, and many people have testified that he is really trying his best to kind of build Ghana into a country that people will admire. That Ghana is one of the fastest growing economy in Africa. Good. But for him to say that, for people to think that having a junta government will be a solution to their problem is misguided, I think that that is not a fair assessment. Because I don't like the fact that people just kind of focus on the coup itself without really looking at the root causes of the main problems. Ask yourself that how did this coup came to be? Why do people support these coup leaders? You need to go back to the root causes in order to figure out the solution. If you just think that the coups in Africa are the main problems, and if you just could take off these coups in Africa, then everything will become normal, I guess you are mistaken. There is a serious problem in Africa, and we all must start addressing that problem. Africa is underdeveloped. The people are suffering. The foreigners, the former colonial master, are exploiting the continent. The political elites are stealing from the people. The people are hungry, are starving, are frustrated. There is a long line of problems in Africa. The coups are not the main sickness. They are just the symptoms. They are just the symptoms. There is a problem in Africa that we, all the Africans, must start addressing. We cannot just do cosmetic surgery and think that it's going to solve the whole problem. It won't do anything. Even if we didn't have the coup today, we will still have it in a year from now, or 2 years, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years. Because there are problems in Africa that need fixing, but no one is willing to talk about them. No one is willing to deal with these problems. They rather just avoid talking about it altogether. And I have never seen a situation that got fixed by itself because people just avoided it. We have to face it. We have to talk about it. And the security issue in the Sahel, that has been ongoing for many years now, even before the coups. And one of the reasons the junta gave for staging the coup is the insecurity problem. And according to the juntas, the foreigners, the French forces, and the United Nations mission, it's called MINUSMA, over there, haven't done anything to resolve the problem. So there was no point having them there if they cannot solve the problem. There was no point keeping an unproductive employee. Why do you need to keep them? So it's just better for everyone if they go. Let's continue.
The belief of young people in democracy as the governance model best suited to build peace and prosperity in our society is under systematic attack. The economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic and the impact of the war in Ukraine have only added to the pressure and the anxiety of our young people. We can also certainly do without having to spend the huge amounts of money we currently spend on security at our northern borders in particular. At this time, unhappily, we feel no sense of the international solidarity that we believe we should receive. It is surely in the interest of the whole world that West Africa should be peaceful and prosperous. We want our young people to be part of a peaceful and prosperous West Africa, rather than part of the thousands that arrive at an unwelcoming Europe after perilous journeys across the Sahara and the Mediterranean Sea. Mr. President, we do not seek to shirk any responsibility for the problems we face that are of our own making. And it bears repeating that we are not craving for sympathy, and we do not want to be a scar on anybody's conscience. But we cannot And the world should not pretend that the present day economic and social conditions of Africa have nothing to do with the historical injustices that have fashioned the structures of the world. It is time to acknowledge openly that much of Europe and the United States have been built from the vast wealth harvested from the sweat, tears, blood, and horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and the centuries of colonial exploitation. Maybe we should also admit that it cannot be easy to build confident and prosperous societies from nations that for centuries have their natural resources looted and their peoples traded as commodities. For centuries, the world has been unwilling and unable to confront the realities of the consequences of the slave trade. But gradually, this is changing, and it is time to bring the subject of reparations firmly to the fore. Granted, the current generations are not the ones that engaged in the slave trade, but that grand inhuman enterprise was state-sponsored and deliberate, and its benefits are clearly interwoven with the present-day economic architecture of the nations that designed and executed it. Reparations must be paid for the slave trade. No amount of money will ever make up for the horrors, but it would make the point that evil was perpetrated, that millions of productive Africans were snatched from the embrace of our continent and put to work in the Americas and the Caribbean without compensation for their labor. If there are any hesitations in some minds about the paying of reparations, it is worth considering the fact that when slavery was abolished, the slave owners were compensated for the loss of the slaves because the human beings were labeled as property, deemed to be commodities. Surely, this is a matter that the world must confront and can no longer ignore. The African Union has authorized Ghana to hold a global conference on the issue in November in Accra. It is probably also the time to return to that vexed subject of illicit financial outflows out of the continent of Africa. I refer to the report of the panel chaired by the highly respected former South African President Thabo Mbeki on the illicit flow of funds from Africa, which states that Africa is losing annually more than 88 billion United States dollars through illicit financial outflows. Yes, those monies too must be returned to the continent. It is difficult to understand why the recipient countries are comfortable about retaining such funds and are happy to call those countries from whom the monies are taken as corrupt. I believe that a joint task force of the African Union Commission and the OECD Secretariat under the auspices of the United Nations should be charged to find ways of stopping the damaging outflows. Mr. President, before the pandemic, we, like many other parts of the world, were making progress with the 17 SDGs, and we had good reason to believe we would achieve the 2030 target. Today, the picture we have on our performance is not very bright. Most of the 21 targets designated for achievement by 2020 have not been met, and we are not on track to achieve many other targets by 2030. According to the 2023 SDG report, just 12% of the SDG targets are on track to be achieved. Progress on 50% of the targets is weak. The most disappointing part is that we have stalled or retrogressed more than 30% of the targets. We need to accelerate action on the entire project. Mr. President, it is within our capacity to turn things round. A good start would be to make the needed changes to the structures of our organization. Then we can rebuild trust and reignite global solidarity.
You know, it's really funny. I have said this like so many times on this platform that France alone collects about $500 billion from their former French colonies in Africa. 500 billion year in, year out. That is what France collects, and that is what we know of. What about the ones we don't know? No one is talking about that one. But let's just talk about the one we know. How can France be saying that Africa is poor where they are collecting that amount of money year in, year out? And we, the Africans, are not collecting anything from France. Who is poor? Who is rich? Is it the one who has to give or the one who has to receive that is poor or rich? Who is poor? Who is rich? You can see the amount of money that France is collecting from Africa. And France will have the audacity to call Africans poor people. The world is really unfair, my brothers and sisters. The world is really, really unfair. You can hear the amount of money that is being sucked out of Africa illegally. And they turn around and call us poor people. Multinational institutions are there sucking from Africa. The multinational banks are there sucking from Africa. The multinational institutions like the IMF and the World Bank are there degrading Africa, saying that Africa is a high-risk zone, when they are there collecting so much money from the continent. And the one that gets me so angry is when it comes to reparations. When Africans are saying that, no, during the slave era, a lot of things were done against the African people. Africans were taken from Africa and sold into slavery, and they had to work day in, day out without any salary. In fact, they did free labor. So their generations should be compensated. And when you talk about this, many white people, many Americans will kick against it, citing that those people who committed the atrocities are long dead, and that this current generation have nothing to do with what their ancestors did. They say all this, but they forget the fact that there is what they call generational wealth. That the slave area, all the labor that African people did during the slave era, helped to build their countries. That the European countries are as wealthy as they are today due to the free labor they got during the slave era. And some prominent families in the United Kingdom and America still enjoy this generational wealth created by their ancestors. And even our precious items that were stolen from Africa, the French, the British, have refused to return those things to us. If they can compensate the slave masters for freeing their slaves, what about those people who were victims of the slavery itself? Shouldn't they be compensated? It is the problem with the world today, because the little guy has no place in the world. The bigger guy is the one that everyone listen to. Everyone listen to. But you guys out there, share your thoughts and opinion on this speech by Nana Akufo-Addo. Do you think that he is right when he said that reparations must be paid to fellow Africans whose ancestors worked as slaves? Let us know in the comment section below, because like always, we love hearing what you have to say. And also, don't forget to like this video, share this video, follow our Facebook page, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel, because little bit of good way, like the one you're doing just now, help us a lot and we shall forever be grateful to you. So thank you very much for doing just that. And like always, see you in the next one.